So first of all, I'd just like to thank Puya for inviting me to be with you today and to be a participant in this conversation. The webinar today, as the title indicates, will propose some thoughts on what it means to be on retreat, and as a result, travel the pathway of growth in human consciousness. So it's really these two ideas that shape my talk today: spirituality of retreat, a path to growth in human consciousness. To note that I am framing the reflection within the Christian tradition of which I am a follower and a practitioner. This is not to presume that the Christian way is or ought to be normative in any way. It is simply the pathway most familiar to me, and I readily acknowledge there are many others, both religious and not. My perspective is shaped by my social identity as a Caucasian middle-class male. I've had the opportunity to travel extensively internationally, and I have lived twice for extended periods of time in cultures different than my own, totaling about 5 years. All of this shapes perspective and understanding. And so I think to begin the reflection, I need to posit at least two working definitions of spirituality. First, spirituality from a non-religious perspective, okay, a non-faith-based perspective, understood as a fundamental human dialectic that facilitates the transformation of the self from self-centeredness to other-centeredness. Here, spirituality is understood as the fundamental practices and changes intentionally sought to establish right relationships with oneself, others, and the cosmos, broadly speaking. And so integral to the changes in the self is a diminishment of the narcissistic self in favor of the pursuit of the common good. Now, the second definition of spirituality from a faith-based, a Christian faith-based perspective is understood as the experience of transformation in the divine human relationship, as it is reflected as a lifestyle within all relationships, that is, with oneself, others, and the cosmos, broadly speaking. Integral to this shift is the practice and modeling of relationships as revealed by Jesus Christ in his life, death, and resurrection. So thus, this faith-based perspective. As you can see, both these definitions are anchored in some process of transformative practice. What is being suggested in this webinar is that this transformation and these practices can be advanced during times of retreat. As we will see in more detail below, transformation is intimately linked with human consciousness, that is, critical self-awareness. Again, thus the title of the webinar, Spirituality of Retreat, a Pathway to Growth in Human Consciousness. Notice again the use of the word a pathway, for there are many others, not least of all the dynamics of spirituality operative in everyday life. What is special about time on retreat is the significance of watching thoughts as a path to liberation of the mind. We're able to watch our thoughts. Retreat time is quiet and allows the unsettled sandy waters of time to settle and become clear, thus allowing knowledge and insight, which leads to the potential of making new decisions and living life differently. We will recognize these dynamics through what is often referred to as mindfulness, that is, being aware of our body, feelings, and thoughts, objectively and without judgment. For the Christian, of course, there is another layer to the consideration, and that is the gift of God's grace, which makes these movements possible. And so there are several points of reference, assumptions, if you like, at the basis of a Christian spirituality of retreat. The first one, retreat calls us to be changed, not in the ways we expect or desire, but in accordance with God's desire for us, or the transcendent, or the sacred, however we name that divine other. The second, retreat allows us to ponder our past, to clarify the current moments of grace and intuit directions for the future. Third, retreat allows us to become more open to the imaginative and creative elements of one's personality. What you can imagine, you can move forward. The fourth assumption, retreat is meant to inspire and challenge, to provoke and question the status quo of our lives. God comes to us wherever we are, but we need to know where we are to invite God into that truth. And the fifth, retreat returns us to the everyday of life, where mystery and meaning meet. Thus, the dynamics of transformative practice continue beyond the retreat, but the capacity for transformation has been deepened because of the settling of the sands in the murky waters of life during the retreat. For the person of faith, every human experience, in whatever setting, has the potential to break open the reality of God. Every human experience has the potential to reveal the ultimate mystery, which is God. The simplest gesture of another human being, a brilliant sunset, a quiet morning stroll, dropping a drinking glass on a hard surface and it smashes all to bits. The busy noise of a freeway, recovery following an accident, and so on. All these have the potential to summon us to another level in our relationship with ourselves, God, others, and creation. The distinction between what is holy and what is not holy is a question of awareness and discernment, rather than predetermined decisions about what these things represent in themselves. What is at the foundation of these 5 points of reference is the reality that God is in the world with us, not if God is in the world with us. The growth in self-awareness and self-understanding, as well as the meaning of our lives, is the first step toward wholeness, or holiness as it's often called. Holiness here is understood as conversion to justice, or right relationships in support of the common good, not for my personal benefit, but for all. We open up the mind to what is beyond the mind, beyond the conceptualization of knowledge, which tends to lead to certainty and thus dead ends. We ponder our situation in life, reflect on our relationships, and open ourselves to the new and unexpected. We know all of this as mindfulness. In Buddhism, mindfulness meditation is a way to transcend rational thought and knowing, such that we achieve enlightenment and are connected to being. For Christians, mindfulness meditation is a way to be connected to the divine being within. We can practice pondering, and we can get better at it by doing it. Retreat allows the time and environment within which to do so. Quiet, contemplative moments may surface even within busy moments in everyday life. But these moments are prepared and nourished by lengthier opportunities to do so. These moments shape, ultimately, Christian prayer. Prayer is becoming mindful of this ongoing dwelling, an intuition of the divine other that resists and resides within. Prayer is a lifestyle that is focused on nurturing a deep sense of interiority that touches God's life through the life of the individual or community, through human actions, human hopes, human desires, and human joys, to name but a few. All these dynamics lead to spiritual growth and transformation because of the critical self-awareness they build. But more is needed. More is needed. And so I'd like to talk a little bit now about Christian asceticism and Christian mysticism, which are fundamental to spiritual growth and transformation. Both these are integral to growth in consciousness, both within everyday life and during times of retreat. So let's talk a little bit about Christian asceticism. Commitment to spiritual practices such as retreats is grounded in a form of asceticism or self-discipline. The contemporary word asceticism finds its origin in ancient Greek word askesis. Askesis referred to various practices of self-discipline, the disciplined exercise or training required by athletes and soldiers for physical and mental health, the acquisition of wisdom by philosophers, or the practice of religious observance by priestly officials in the temple. In short, askesis, translated as ascesis, refers to the methodical and intentional actions needed to meet the goals at hand. However, today asceticism is more closely identified with various religious or spiritual practices and expressions. The conventions of Buddhists, Muslims, and Christians all include a range of expressions of ascetic discipline that are described as ascetic exercises. What does asceticism do? Why do we introduce that in a talk on transformation? Asceticism helps people find a balance in life between competing desires. When any one desire becomes so absolute that everything else is ignored, life can become a tyranny. The human being is a mix of desires and impulses that sometimes compete with one another, and a balance needs to be achieved. Asceticism is needed to help awaken people to what is important in life, to what is permanent, or at least enduring. For the sake of growth and something more, we choose to place boundaries on some of our ambiguous desires. For example, the desire for misuse of sexuality, unjust possessions, manipulative power, or abusive relationships. The love of God and neighbor requires practice until we get it right. Without asceticism, we are easily seduced into living under the pretense that there are no limits in life. Thus, desire and fantasy become one under that illusion. Let's talk a little bit now about Christian mysticism. Within Christian traditions, mysticism has often been viewed as an advanced state of spiritual life, one that reflects a greater degree of human development or holiness or state of perfection as demonstrated in ecstatic or extraordinary experiences. Yet this does not seem to be accurate, given the witness of many ordinary men and women, and children too, who recount the close experience of God in their everyday lives in mundane ways. Mystical experience is simply the experience of the immanence of the holy other God, in contrast to the experience of God as distant. At the heart of Christian mysticism, therefore, is the conception of God not as a transcendent other, but as an immanent self. And so the goal of Christian mysticism is not primarily an act of union or of a particular moment of encounter with the divine other. The goal is to live one's entire life in the mysterium called God. Given that the experience of mysticism is widespread if we are attentive to it, it is very difficult to define it in a general way that applies to all traditions. Each tradition or spirituality will have a preferred way or number of ways to express this widespread reality. Bernard McGinn, a contemporary writer on mysticism, indicates that mystical experiences are religiously specific experiences. I quote, Buddhists have Buddhist mystical experiences, Jews have Jewish ones, and Christians have mystical experiences relating to Christ, end quote. And so our understanding of mysticism in this way refocuses the life of Christians on the daily reality of their world in creative acts of Christian belief, hope, and love. God's self-communication engages from within the routine everyday experiences of believing, hoping, and loving. And so spiritual transformation and growth as they engage asceticism and mysticism shape and give expression to what is often referred to as the classical spiritual itinerary, which we have already heard some presentation of from Jody. What I'm about to say now, I think, and I believe complements and repeats somewhat of what he's already said. And so the traditional three ways of the Christian life, the purgative way, the illuminative way, and the unitive way, are often referred to as the classical spiritual itinerary. Although they are described separately with their own salient characteristics and method of prayer, together these ways form a singular journey that leads the Christian ever more deeply in the life and love of God in this world that God and humans share. They are often presented in a linear fashion, but the three ways are integrated aspects of spiritual and human development, attempts to describe the cyclical movements of grace in human life. So it's more accurate to model them as a cyclical movement, an never-ending deepening of transformation and personal growth. Although many Christians used this terminology, going back to the biblical text, to describe and characterize this journey, John of the Cross in the 16th century, as we already heard from Jody, presented the most thorough and systematic analysis of the three ways. This happened at the height of mysticism in Europe, and I think paradoxically, at the height of the Spanish Inquisition. We will use John's writings for the presentation which follows. Let's talk a little bit more then about the purgative way. The purgative way is commonly associated with the state also known as the beginners. The need to set out on the purgative way comes when an individual realizes that as she or he has grown into maturity, there is a further desire for growth and maturation. The individual becomes to understand that the desire for something more can only be achieved by moving beyond current debilitating boundaries and dispositions. Jody used the word achieve transcendence, or desire for transcendence. This awareness or desire is not meant to negate anything about one's life, but to help correct what is debilitating and draining. Thus, the purgative way describes the journey of somebody setting out to reform primary attitudes that to date may well have guided the individual, but due to his or her own limitations, are now preventing the individual from further personal and spiritual transformation. People who are launched along the purgative way seek to become more disciplined about many aspects of their lives, so that they can move from self-centeredness to other-centeredness. When the purgative way begins to correct, or what the purgative way begins to correct, is people's false sense of reality and their relationship to it. Current values and categories of knowledge are questioned and reshaped. Most significantly, the purgative way seeks to purify one's image of God and reorient one toward the truth of God in one's life and in the world. The purgative way is often associated with those beginning stages of asceticism. Next comes the illuminative way. After a period of transition, the Christian enters into what spiritual authors have termed the illuminative way, also known as the state of proficience. The entry into the illuminative way is characterized by a major shift from discursive prayer, focused on concepts and saying one's prayer, and active self-discipline, to a more contemplative form of prayer and self-possession. The paradox here is that far from becoming self-absorbed and self-preoccupied in this more contemplative stance, the Christian realizes more than ever that life is lived from a well of life deep within that expresses itself in an active love toward others, the world, and God. The embodiment of self-giving, spontaneous love is the hallmark of the illuminative way. The Christian is illuminated by the loving grace of God in life and in the quiet prayer of loving contemplation, in contrast to the busy, discursive mental prayer that characterized the prayer of the purgative way. Mysticism grows in the dynamics of the illuminative way. One is illumined or learns more profoundly about the truth of life in all of its aspects. The falsehoods of the self are even more finely stripped away to reveal a truer and more authentic notion of the self. So the state of the illuminative way, in contrast to that of the purgative, may last many years to conform the individual more completely to the illuminated heart and mind of God. In fact, in its initial phase, the illuminative way may not be experienced as illuminating at all. Because the individual is discovering new ways to be in relationship to the world and to others, the initial part of this illuminative journey is fraught with confusion and uncertainty, as is to be expected when charting a new course into the unknown. As the pilgrim continues to experience this purification, there eventually comes what is commonly known as the dark night of the soul. So the dark night is part of the upper levels of the illuminative way according to John of the Cross. So the dark night of the soul refers to the most intense experience of the purification process cited to this point. Due to the divine light that assails the individual, John of the Cross indicates that a pilgrim feels, and I quote, so unclean and wretched that it seems God is against him and he is against God. So intense is this experience that the individual appears completely lost. This experience indicates the culmination of the illuminative way. What is happening here psychologically is a constitutive and fundamental reorientation of the personality structure. In the dark night, the individual can no longer sustain comfortable illusions about who he or she is before others or before God. John calls this a dark night, since the natural light of one's own capacity to know and make sense out of things no longer functions in any familiar way. But the light of God has not yet been revealed in its fullness. The dark night of the soul is not a passing psychological state that one will get over. It is a spiritual category that describes the state of existence that opens the radical awareness of one's absolute and utter dependence on some mystical, sacred, divine other, in the Christian experience, named God. What stands out in the public forum, those experiencing the dark night of the soul will scarcely be seen to be doing so at all by others. What will be abundantly obvious are generous acts of charity, spontaneous acts of forgiveness and reconciliation, and extreme moral integrity. In the public realm, the reformation and the transformation has taken place and shows itself, notwithstanding the darkness of those nights. And then we move on to what John describes as the unitive way. Following the dark night of the soul, individuals enter the unitive way. Those who enter this way are also known as the perfects. Unlike the marked shift in prayer life that characterizes the transition from the purgative way to the illuminative way, no dramatic change takes place in the transition from the illuminative way to the unitive way. In the illuminative way, the Christian would have experienced certain touches of union, transitory experiences of the closeness of God. In the unitive way, there's a quality of immediacy in that relationship. John of the Cross describes this as being one with God. Within the entry into the way, the unitive way of substantial union is established with God. And before an individual may have felt absence of God, in the unitive way, there's a habitual presence that God is now experienced deep within. We see here again the dynamics of mysticism at play, habitual, felt experience of God in the everyday life. And so the unitive way represents the completion of the transformation of one's life and how it conforms to God. The individual has been drawn fully into participation in divine nature. All aspects of his or her life have been directed toward the love of God in this world. And John says not that the individual is not capable of mistake, error, or sin, but the likeliness of that happening and those mistakes occurring are far more or less likely. In psychological terms, the individual has achieved an extremely high level of personal integration and maturity. In the unitive way, life will continue with its disappointments and losses, joys and celebrations, until mortal death ushers the Christian into the eternal embrace of God. And so, in conclusion, transformation and spiritual growth are supported by periods of retreat, during which time one seeks to grow in human consciousness, understood as critical self-awareness. Self-knowledge is the foundation of all human growth, which in turn allows us to tap reservoirs of life not yet explored. While religious people may gain growth in human consciousness by pursuing spiritual practices such as retreats, non-religious people may pursue the same journey through other means. What is common to both is the necessity of some form of spirituality that facilitates the transformation of the self from self-centeredness to other-centeredness, such that there is a diminishment of the narcissistic self in favor of the common good. This requires work, asceticism, if you like, that leads to a personal sense of freedom and meaning in life that enhances human flourishing on all levels to achieve one's full potential. The threefold classical spiritual itinerary is one way of describing the pathway that leads to this full human potential. So with that, I end my reflection. Thank you very much for your time and attentive listening.
Thank you, Professor David Perrin. There are some questions here. Professor Ravi Chinta from District University of Columbia asked this question. What is the difference between religion and spiritualism? Is it possible that someone do not believe in God? Is it possible for him or her to progress in the spiritual journey?
Well, I can give a brief answer to that question. In terms of religion and spirituality, it's, of course, a very highly debated issue in the literature in relationship to what is the division, if any. But to simplify that, religion is often identified with, stable and beliefs and practices sort of organized into an institutional shape and identified as a particular brand of religion, Christianity or Judaism and so on. Answer, sort of a short answer question to the second part would be, can people that are non-faith-based set out on the spiritual journey? And I really want to give an absolutely resounding yes to that issue and to that question. I mean, people find their way into self-transcendence and to human maturation and are drawn into some level of mystical consciousness outside any religious framework. And I only think religions and spirituality make sense if we understand spirituality as a fundamental constitutive part of what it means to be human before we even start talking about faith-based or religious tradition. So that's kind of my short answer there.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Regina Bento from University of Baltimore, United States, asked this question: how can progressing in spiritual journey and improving humans' consciousness increase the odds that leadership will express the golden rule?
I think here again, it comes back to, I think, what Jody was presenting in terms of an engagement and a growing in empathy of the other, such that individuals are not instrumentalized to achieve goals, albeit goals that are important for business and other such type leadership needs. But there's some kind of a median or a balance between achieving what needs to be achieved in terms of business and also understanding the other as a unique human being with his or her own particular history and feelings, strengths and weaknesses. And I think that empathetic stance goes a long way in leadership to achieving, the outcomes of the golden rule and really seeing us as a community moving together and notwithstanding the responsibilities that a leader or a boss may have with respect to getting a team moving in any particular direction. But to treat other people as ends in themselves, I think is an important part, this empathetic perspective of that golden rule perspective.
Thank you, Professor Perrin. Personally, I have a question about the difference between the first dark night of the soul that happens in the purgative way and the second dark night of the soul that happen in the illuminative way. Is there any differences between two dark night of the soul?
There is, in fact, and I know Margaret Benefill that Jody referred to, and she presents John of the Cross in a slightly nuanced way. So there are two dark nights of the soul, but I'd like to suggest that maybe Margaret has placed it not entirely consistent with John of the Cross's journey, because John of the Cross places the two dark nights at the height of the illuminative way. And the first dark night is the dark night of the senses. Okay, the dark night of the senses. So it's the dark night of knowledge, whereby the knowledge, the way we do things, our habits are thrown into question. The second dark night is what John of the Cross calls the dark night of the spirit. And that's the most transformative and the darkest of the nights. And that is, if you like, what I referred to on a psychological level as the reshaping of sort of one's fundamental perspective in life and finding a new way, a new pathway that really is transformative. So that's the difference. One's the dark night of knowledge, one's dark night of spirit. If that's kind of the short answer, Puya, if I could frame it that way. Does that make any sense to you?
Thank you. I got it.
Okay.
Another question is, there is a different approach to ultimate reality in Christianity and Islamic mysticism. For example, you mentioned in your book that falling in sin is possible for a person who reached the ultimate reality, who reached unitive position, unitive state. It is possible falling in sin for that person. But in Islamic mysticism, there is an approach that in teaching of Islamic mysticism, there is a belief that if a person reach to absorb in ultimate reality and reach to the ultimate point in the level of being and united with God, it is not possible for him or her to falling in sin. Would you please tell us more about the idea of falling in sin for people who reach the ultimate reality?
So I can speak to that from the Christian perspective and from the perspective of John of the Cross, because he does talk obviously about the spiritual marriage, which is a term I didn't use in my talk, but the state of union, oneness with God. And he talks about in his Living Flame of Love about becoming one with God to the point where we become God. And he uses that term, we become God. I'm surprised that the Spanish Inquisition didn't kind of hold him up, and he was, kind of stretched on the rack there for saying that, because that would have not been acceptable to Catholic Church at that time. Now, what John is saying is that we do not give up our humanity this side of eternity. We are still human beings, even though we've achieved a very, very high level of oneness with God, union with God. We are creatures on this earth, and we still put one step ahead of the other, walking our pilgrim way. So John leaves open the possibility of failure, or what we call theologically sin, because of our humanity. However, he does say it's highly unlikely, and that's the term he uses, highly unlikely, that one has achieved that sense of oneness, that integration, that sense of wholeness. It's highly unlikely that one will fall in that pathway. So Puya, that's kind of John's answer to your question.
Thank you. In Islamic mysticism, there is a belief that if it is possible that a person completely absorbed to ultimate reality, and every behavior, every action of that person is the full manifestation of God.
Yeah.
This is the meaning of completely absorbed to ultimate reality, because this is a journey that is not the ending point. And if I think about this idea, it is my desire that meet that person. I really like to meet that person who absorb completely in the ultimate reality. So it is not possible, because I can imagine that person in my mind. When I can imagine that person in my mind, so we can conclude that it is possible that someone completely absorbed in ultimate reality. And if we believe that God, it is not possible for God to make mistake or falling in sin. So if a person completely absorbed to ultimate reality, to God, it is not possible for him to falling in sin. It is my understanding.
Yeah, so there's different perspectives.
Have you got the meaning I want to convey?
Yeah. No, I understand. It's a, how we look at these. There are various perspectives. I mean, I did write another book called For Love of the World, The Old and the New Self of John of the Cross, and it really takes us to that 99.9% of the journey but leaves that 0.1% of our humanity that's still intact because we're human beings. So that's the point I can make from John's writings, is we haven't given up our humanity, notwithstanding union with ultimate reality. So how do we balance and keep that tension together? So some writers would say it's not possible. John would say probably not possible, but he leaves open the question.
Thank you.
He doesn't want us to give up our humanity. That's too precious.
Thank you so much. I really benefit from your knowledge and experience. I'm reading your articles and your book. All of your articles and books are fantastic and really beneficial for us. When I compare the teaching of your books, Christian approach to mysticism with Islamic mysticism, it is really helpful for us to deep understanding the meaning of spiritual journey. You mentioned the difference between discursive prayer and contemplative prayer. My question is there any training to move from discursive prayer to contemplative prayer?
Yes, there is. And I would say within the Catholic tradition, the Christian tradition that I belong to, there's sort of like, quite a few prayers that are written down. There are meditations. There are spiritual readings. And I think engaging those, so discursive prayer, that's when you're reading, you're using your mind, you're using your intellect, you're following through. But that kind of prayer can lead to a deepening of one's awareness of the divine spirit that resides within, that moves us towards contemplative prayer that is achieved in multiple ways, and it can be mediated in multiple ways, like a sunset, a statue of beauty, listening to a piece of music. So I think in the early stages, people need to be disciplined about whatever tradition they adhere to, reading those prayers, being part of liturgical exercises, being part of communitarian expressions of faith. That will deepen, and the other will surface and become even more dominant and prominent in one's prayer life. So this ongoing presence of the divine spark within, the divine nature within. So I think there is a transition there, and then one feeds the other, and there's a dynamic back and forth. So we never give up reading scripture, but it's also a good place to begin.
Thank you so much. There is a difference between being and existence. Most of the articles and books use the word being for describing the level of spiritual journey. They use level of being instead of level of existence. Which words is more appropriate for the spiritual journey, being or existence?
Is that for me, Puya?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would like to agree with our presenter that existence is a far better category. Being gets us into all kinds of problems and traps. We went through that in Christianity with ontotheology that was really searching for, the characteristics of divine attributes. It leads to a dead end at the end of the day. So God really is better understood as existence. And then when you push that, it's relational existence. That's really the fundamental and core to the spiritual journey. So that'd be my short answer there, Puya.
Thank you so much, Professor Perrin. I will share your paper with our followers, and thank you for taking your precious time to our webinar.
It was my pleasure, and thank you to everybody for engaging.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.